reason for that is clear. I can't teach you anything. And I know you're kind of giggling over there, but it's absolutely true. I can't teach you anything. All that I can do, all that we can do is create an opportunity for you to learn for yourselves. You have to do it, try it, practice it if you're going to develop a capability.
All right, well, welcome to the first episode of the Combat Ecosphere. Today I'm joined by Josh Peacock, bottom left, Coach Greg Souders, top right, and Coach Kabir, bottom right. How you doing, boys?
Good, how are you, Scott?
Good.
Pretty good.
Great.
So the idea, the brainchild behind this little video series is to discuss all things ecological dynamics and how they pertain to grappling and development in grappling. And this is the first episode. We've been each individually getting a lot of communication and people getting in touch with us to find out a little bit more about the ecology and an ecological dynamics approach to martial arts, which we've all been advocating for some while. So this is the first of many episodes. We'll see how it goes. Let's start going clockwise. Greg Souders, tell a little bit about yourself and take it away.
What's going on, guys? Yeah, so I guess any of you guys watching this already know who I am. My name is Greg Souders. I run a school called Standard Jiu-Jitsu in Rockville, Maryland. A couple months ago, I got introduced by Scott to talk about how I run a completely ecological program here at my school, from the foundations program all the way to the advanced. And most recently, I've been on a series of podcasts trying to teach other coaches or talk to the community about how I've been doing it and the success I've been having. And I've also been communicating with the community individual by individual through Instagram. So yeah, I'm just trying to get the information out there so other coaches can start utilizing this approach and hopefully find as much success as I've had.
Great. Coach Kabir, Bath.
Hey, so I'm Kabir Bath. I run a school just outside of Vancouver, BC called Kaboom BJJ. Now for us, we focus really on youth side of jiu-jitsu. We still have like a decent adult program, but we've really implemented this method with our youth. So over 300 kids, they train all through games, constraints, never really drilling moves, stuff like that. And, you know, I've been on a couple of podcasts sharing, and it's been really interesting to see how quickly people who have implemented it have just started actually loving coaching kids, and their kids are now loving jiu-jitsu again. So I think there's a really big room for benefit here too. And then also, of course, I've done it with my adults too, and, you know, they're all about it. So I'm really excited to see how this continues to grow and affects our sport.
All right, and last but not least, Coach Josh Peacock.
Not active, Coach. So I do the Combat Learning podcast. I interview lots of eggheads in the space, and I also talk to coaches that are in the trenches to give people an idea of the nitty gritty of how people that are using the constraints-led approach and the ecological approach, how they're applying that in their everyday classes for their programs. So right now, I'd love to coach again, but right now, my purpose in the Combat Ecosphere, as we're calling it now, is to describe the methodology in a way that people can better understand, maybe to systemize some things, not too much, but to actually organize things in a way that people can action upon the sometimes vague principles of constraints-led approach. And also to just upset people on Facebook and Reddit.
That's my favorite topic.
All right, and I'm Scott Sievewright. I am the host of the Primal MMA coaching podcast. I run a gym with my partner, Primal MKE, MMA and Fitness. We have been running for about 3 years now. A bit of an experiment, wholly aligned and committed to an ecological approach, 100% ecological approach. And that continues to evolve as we go and how I learn and interpret the principles and the science of the whole space. So again, today will be more of a general introduction to us, and we will be going into more specific topics and hopefully getting on some of the so-called eggheads that Josh mentioned earlier on to help iron out and have deep dives into some of these topics. But today I thought perhaps we could all talk a little bit. What I've been talking to you guys individually about is, as more and more people come in space, there's a tendency to maybe either be misunderstood or again, some not perhaps, as I say, really quite misinterpreting what we're actually trying to say with the ecological approach. I know personally for me, we can maybe come across as if we know exactly the way to do this. And I think the underlying principles of ecological approach and non-linearity means we're actually just following a set of principles. So whatever information you get, certainly from me, isn't definitely the way to do it. But again, we're just adhering to some of the principles that the science is telling us. So,
Well, I mean, I think all three of us, and Josh being a little bit different because of his position, is that not that we're authorities, but we've been applying this for quite some time. I've been trying to understand it through application for around 8 years now, and I've completely committed my program to solely using it and no instruction in the traditional sense since 2019. So, I mean, it's really that. We're trying to share our experiential knowledge and what we've seen based on our understanding, not only of the science itself, but again, our personal understanding of its utility.
okay. And Greg, you said you've been lots of people have been reaching out. You've been working with a lot of coaches now. Is there a kind of a common thread when we talk about maybe what a misunderstanding is, and perhaps what people are maybe are picking up intuitively, or what they're maybe not quite grasping about the whole approach?
Yeah, so the confusion from my side of things is the misunderstanding of technique and behavior, right? So we have to understand that a technique is a series of behaviors. And so those behaviors relate to objective problem solution. So again, we have an objective in the grappling game that we're playing. We face problems as we try to achieve this objective. We come up with solutions, and those solutions are what we traditionally call techniques. But then if we break down those techniques, once they emerge, we see basic human behavior emerge. So what I think people don't understand is what we're trying to get emerge. And in my argument, it's behavior that will ultimately call a technique, but not technique as a singular thing. And I realize this is a big sticking point for everybody. As I talk to people and they communicate with me and they try to use the approach, they keep missing that idea. It's behavior, it's behavior, it's behavior. It's these little simple human behaviors that ultimately turn into these complex behaviors we call technique. And I think that's a big issue for most people. They don't understand that.
Kabir, are you coming across? Kabir, are you coming across some of the similar issues or thoughts there?
Yeah, so actually, it's really interesting talking about that technique versus behavior and recognizing that there's this, a technique is just that grouping of a couple of behaviors in sequence or whatever it is. Because I find one of the biggest challenges for people when they're trying to implement is they don't know what they're really looking at in some regards. So they don't know that this technique is actually like an isolation of the arm followed by, they don't see all those little sub skills that are like, the technique is just wrapping it up in a nice package. Hey, this is 3 skills being executed in succession, right? But when we do that, we sort of rob people of actually understanding the individual skills. They just get this like big picture thing. So I do find that a lot. And then that's why sometimes people can have a hard time implementing, because they really don't super understand why they've done what they've done. And that makes it challenging. I've seen that a lot when it comes to just people's application. It's like they're like, okay, what are games? They just want the games, or they want some drills or whatever they can do. But it's going to be hard if they don't exactly know what they're looking at in the first place.
Josh, anything to add to that?
Yeah. So the thing about the ecological approach is that we want the students to be less cognitive. We want them to be focused on not the details. We want them focused on the information external to themselves, so that they can let self-organization take over. But coaches have to actually abstract things a little more. So we were talking about like the fundamental aspects of an arm lock is about using pressure to isolate the elbow and then putting torque on the elbow. There's 3, 4, 5 major ways to do that when we're just talking about like a standard arm bar. So jiu-jitsu guys get too in the weeds. They're like, don't cross your legs because you can't produce as much isolation on the elbow. But there is a place to have your legs crossed, because that helps you create pressure with your knees that you can use to keep somebody's head down to stop them from escaping. And so when we're not thinking about, first of all, we're not letting people just adapt in the moment. You can let people feel it, and people naturally cross their legs when they're in an armbar from mount position, because they feel that they can create pressure with their knees that can help them control the person that's bucking underneath. And when you try to disrupt that as a jiu-jitsu instructor, because you know that you can get the submission better, or you think you know you can get the submission better by pinching your knees, maybe pinching knees comes next, or maybe they find a way to finish it without pinching the knees. When you do that, you disrupt it, and they're going to perform worse, and they're going to be less adaptable. And this kind of just perpetuates this idea that you need to know all the individual techniques. You need to know step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And you need to know all the little variations. So you get these technique collector guys that are obsessed, like collecting Pokemon, all the different techniques and all their little variations. And all they want to do is talk about every little thing that you can change. And if you can do it this way in this situation, you can do it this way in this situation. And so it creates almost like a psychosis, if you will, that perpetuates itself, that everyone thinks, oh, there's so much more to learn. There's so much to learn. I just need more techniques. I need more details. I've got to go back to the special basics class so I can get all the little minute details that I'm not getting in the advanced class about this basic technique. And it's just not true. You need to understand, you've got to isolate the elbow. You've got to isolate the knee, and you've got to create torque on the knee. And there's different ways to do that, but those are the invariant features of it. And so nobody has a sense of self-organization. I think that's one of the major things that's starting to come to the fore now, is that everybody's like, yes, we do positional sparring, or yeah, I get it. You got to have more live, more, not technique. You got to have more live practice. But this idea that directing attention and giving objectives cannot organize behavior on its own, that behavior can be emergent. I think that's one of we're starting to understand that's one of the major gulfs that we have to cross with people that are not ecological. Because right now people are increasingly receptive to like this constraints-led, scalable live training sort of idea. Like, yeah, we got to have more live practice and less rote drilling. But they don't want to get rid of the rote drilling, and especially the repetitions, because they just don't understand self-organization at all.
Well, they don't even understand what they're doing. Forget self-organization. They literally don't understand how to separate situations. They don't understand the macro, meso, and micro situations that emerge in a grappling game. They just don't see it, right? So they don't, like, I try to simplify this for all of my students and people I talk to, and maybe this will help you guys even. But all you guys are well read and well understood. Every time I talk to you guys, I realize quickly that you guys are clearly on the same page that I am. But we largely play a very simple game. We play a game of pinning. Like, we're playing a pinning game. Right? Mm-hmm. We're not really doing anything else. And the way the body organizes around pinning and the avoiding pinning is what we're doing. So, again, trying to teach the community how to simplify these situations so they can focus on why tactics emerge, I think is the starting point for us as coaches and people trying to implement ecology. We have to use ecology to reteach jiu-jitsu so that they can, learn about ecology and then apply it to jiu-jitsu. I think, again, we have to merge the two.
I'd like to add to that. Maybe a coach hears you talk like that, Greg. And I had a young Ricky Pachon on from Gracie Baja.
I spoke to him for 3 hours last week.
And he was a bit apprehensive. Even at brown belt, he thought, after listening to you, thinking maybe I don't understand jiu-jitsu enough, is the way you understand it. But what I'd like to get across to anyone listening today is that once you start playing these games, your knowledge of jiu-jitsu will rapidly improve as you see the games, as you develop games, and as you tweak the games. So there's not a prerequisite to switching over to a more ecological approach for me. Just Kabir's done it. We all have we've all had a experience with the sport. But again, and I don't know if you can speak to that, Kabir, just since you've gone down this more ecological route, has your understanding of the game changed at all?
Yeah, so absolutely. I found my understanding changed because I had to be able to communicate what's happening in the simplest terms, right? How can I reduce this to a basic framework? And that's actually how I start like every class. If this week we're working on the top position, I'll always start with, hey, remember our high level overview. Every time we're on top, You got to keep people down, stay on top, get past their limbs, get to their body, and start working to submit. I always start with like, can I describe what this week is about in one sentence? Because that should be like the first thing. That's sort of like how I'm going to give my students like that North Star for the session. It's like, oh, that's what everything subsequent game wise is falling into this big umbrella. And I find that's hard initially, right? When you haven't tried to whittle away everything and just look at what's happening in that lens. And that's, to do that has made my jiu-jitsu way better, my understanding of jiu-jitsu. But I think that's just like inherent with like any time, if you were to be very deliberate about trying to plan out and communicate your information, you would have a similar net effect, right? But I think just as a whole, coaches tend to not do that. They think of a quick couple moves that they want to show from this scenario, but they don't really go into the why we're doing that, or what is the context for what would actually make that situation arise, and So it's really forced me as a coach to have to figure that out, because I need to, like, my job as a coach is to be able to get you more skills as fast as possible, right? As effectively as possible, which means I have to like be very intentional with what I say and what I choose to make you focus on as my student, right? It's very easy to confuse your student, right? So it has required me to really think about what's happening a lot more, like more than ever. I would say like my jiu-jitsu has gotten way better in the last like 8 months since I've just been focused on this. And then, yeah, it's been really interesting to see the effect too, and how students now describe and approach jiu-jitsu, even white belts. Like they know way more jiu-jitsu than I did as like a blue or purple belt, just because they actually do a bunch of jiu-jitsu. So their questions are more targeted. The problems they see are different than just like, help, I'm pinned all the time. They don't ask not dumb, because they don't ask those like vague open questions. They're like, oh, I can never, get back to the inside position here, or I'm having a hard time keeping the top corner of their body down when I'm pinning from here, or like just the way that they're looking at and understanding has changed. But it took a lot, I felt, to start reducing jiu-jitsu to just a couple core things, isolating the moving parts, recognizing that it's like the body that we're thinking about, not the moves that we're doing, and sort of trying to impart that onto the students.
Yeah. Did you want to say something about that, Scott?
No, I agree. So one of the things I'd like to maybe make a differentiation about is teaching versus learning. And I believe, it's every coach's endeavor to be the best teacher they can be, but I don't confuse the two. And go ahead, Greg. Sounds like you've got something to say about that.
Oh yeah. So a friend of mine just kind of, we talk, it's another guy. He's a blue belt in jiu-jitsu, but he's a strength conditioning coach. He actually specializes in breathing. He develops breathwork programs, but he said this thing to me today, and I just thought it was his own thought, and I thought it was pretty good. He said, you cannot deliver understanding. You can only deliver knowledge and opportunity. Understanding has to emerge as an artifact of experience. If you think you've delivered understanding, it's only knowledge about, never knowledge of. And so I thought that was a really good point. And because he and I speak literally daily, and he's trying to distill it down for his own understanding to apply it into his other field. And I think that's really it. I think the way we have to look at ourselves as coaches is a different thing. We're not knowledge tellers per se. Now, coach to coach, we may be, but as a coach designing practice, we are opportunity creators. So we want to give our student the opportunity to discover what we now know, and we have to understand that the opportunity is based on, I'm going to say it because I was obsessed with it, foundational behaviors that build other behaviors that build other behaviors. And I think that really is the key to not only deepening our own understanding, but developing good practice.
Josh, you want to give a quick summary of the difference between knowledge about and knowledge of?
Sure. Yeah. And I also want to add to the idea of teaching, because that's another emerging gulf, I think, in terms of speaking to people about what it means for us when we say that we're not teaching moves. We mean something different than they do, I think. But yeah, so knowledge about is the propositions. It's the head knowledge. It's the stuff you read out of a book or you watch in a video. It's the things that you think about. It's more abstract. Knowledge of is experiential. It's engaging in the act of doing it, whatever it is, whether it's doing math or engaging in a role in jiu-jitsu. That's knowledge of. It's experiential knowledge, really, whereas knowledge about is head knowledge. But on the point in terms of teaching, I view teaching as first designing a particular learning experience. So that's really facilitating learning, but you are directing that, you're designing that in a way, and so I view that as teaching in more of a remote sense. And then secondarily, but probably more important to the actual word teaching, the way most people use it, I view teaching as directing attention. So I'm directing your attention rather than just giving you knowledge, right? I'm not just passing knowledge from my brain to yours. I'm helping you solve a problem by directing your attention, where my experience helps me understand where it might need to be. So I'm taking sort of like this Japanese concept of sensei. A sensei is not like a formal title. A sensei is somebody who's been there before. They have that experience. So I'm using my experience to help direct your attention in a way that might help you organize yourself more effectively. That's how I view teaching. The IP view of teaching, or the default view of teaching, is much more expansive. It's everything. It's facilitating learning. It's going into all the fine details of knowledge transfer between one brain and the other. It's directing attention, not usually directing attention, but it can include directing attention. And so teaching just does not have any firm, the word teaching doesn't really have a firm, it can be an instruction, it can be designing, it can be everything. And so the new sort of meta right now with talking to people is I'll share a video of Greg's class, or some other example of a constraints-led type of learning environment. And everything I said goes out the window because they watch it and said, oh, well, Greg, he gave instructions, so that means he teaches moves.
But
like,
giving
okay.
it, so I mean, that's why I use the word knowledge teller, because I like to make a clear, distinct difference. So a traditional approach is I'm a knowledge teller. I'm going to tell you knowledge, and that knowledge is going to affect you, right? But me giving information is just another constraint. They're two different things. Like if I tell somebody to focus your intention on gaining access to inside space, and we focus our attention on the way we're doing it, this is just, like you said, helping guide their attention so they can experience it for themselves. This isn't really me telling them anything about the situation. I'm just telling them where to guide their intention and attention to help facilitate their own experience of the situation.
Right. Yeah. And so they look at you, and I mean, in the video in question, you said I had to say more in this class than I usually do, just because it was just people were struggling. But it's like, what was the extent of what you said? Like, just use both legs, like reach out with both legs to hook. Don't leave it hanging, or things like that. And it's fun. I don't know. The people we're talking to, I think most of them are disingenuous at the start. So we have to put up with them being juvenile, really. They're not disciplined thinkers, most of them. The culture of jiu-jitsu is that jiu-jitsu is cerebral and intellectual. And so there's a sort of social script that, especially on the BJJ subreddit, that's just Reddit culture, is this idea of, it's my enemy too. But it's growing my podcast, so I can't complain too much. So there's this idea that we're the smart guys. We're the thinkers in the martial arts. We have this, as long as I can use some fancy word from educational psychology, I'll lop in cognitive load. I'll lock in, I read this book. Let's talk about myelinization is why ecology can't be true. We speak intellectualism to them is like a domain of fixed content. You just say the right words and you're an intellectual. And so when you actually, that's not what intellectualism is. It's a process of clarifying, of reason. It doesn't have fixed content. And so when you actually engage in intellectual discourse, they get upset. They start acting up. And so I just That's kind of tangential, but we have to just put up with that, because if you can put up with it and just continue to sort of grind and ask the questions, the ones that don't rage quit and start attributing motives to you, like you're just, this or that, or you're trying to sell something, eventually they'll come back and be like, okay, the tone will change, and they're like, all right, tell me more.
The two main things I hear when we're advocating for this or talking about it, first of all, I think, and maybe it's fair, there's an extra burden of proof on us, right? We're coming to the table with maybe something new and non-traditional. But the main one is, that's just sparring. It's just situational sparring. We do that all the time, which I think is missing the point. And then the other one is, I think most coaches in the space will, agree with this, that there's this very deep, ingrained thought that getting the fundamentals down is a prerequisite to getting on with the ecological approach. Does anyone want to talk about why we believe it's not at all a prerequisite?
Well, I don't know. Maybe here
and what even word, that muddy word fundamentals mean.
I don't think it's muddy. I'm obsessed with that word. Like, I think about it constantly. Like, I think fundamentals is a real thing, but it's not moves. It's something else. So playing the game is like operating any other object or playing any other game in the world. Let's say you want to learn how to race a bike. I use the bike as the simplest example. If you can't balance on a moving two-wheel object, you don't have the foundation of bike riding. So the first thing you have to do is learn how to balance on a two-wheeled object. That's foundational. Everything thereafter comes out of your ability to balance, right? So this is the same thing in our sport. If we're talking about the game of pinning or the game of immobilization as it leads to strangulation and breaking, we have to define how the game is being played. And then once we do, we can say, okay, what's the first thing a person must do in order to play any aspect of this game? Now, when I say any aspect, it doesn't matter where you start. So in that sense, there's no foundational starting point in the whole game, but there are foundational skills in any of the macro positions that we can say. So let's say we're talking about guards. We want to teach jiu-jitsu starting from guards first. Well, the top player has to stay on top and hold their partner down. That's foundational, because you can't define top positioning without those two things. So again, foundational meaning you strip it all down, and what do you have left? If you strip it any further, you don't have anything left. So then it must be stay on top, hold your partner down. There's nothing else. So then all skills that emerge from the top player's position as they play the game of immobilization as it leads to strangulation and breaking is your ability to stay on top and hold your partner down. Everything else is secondary. So foundations is real. It's just we have to take that word seriously.
Yeah, you have to abstract it. Fundamentals is not a fixed. It's not a fixed collection of techniques. It's an effect.
Well, that's the problem is people don't understand the difference between skill and technique. And again, there's all these.
Oh yeah, that's another thing with teaching and skill. These are all poorly, undisciplined, very badly defined words that we use and we talk back and forth about.
Kabir, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I find the stressing of like fundamentals to be so useless, because most people, when they're thinking of that, they're thinking like, oh, they need to know all these moves so that they can play the game and not just like die immediately or something like that, But man, I can like the real fundamentals are like telling them what's important. Like what's important is that you create space here and that you be able to keep people away from you, and that these basic things just so that they can play, right? I think too often we think in order to play, you need to understand every one of those little micro situations and what happens within each of those. But really, you just sort of need to like be able to understand the map of jiu-jitsu, like where do things flow from here to there and what happens in between, but not really the like particulars, because it's been interesting for me. So I've had now for like 8 months or so we've been running. I have a bunch of students who've never like learned the fundamentals, but they do so many reps of engaging in these live games in important scenarios that they can go into competitions with like not knowing as many moves, but be able to navigate that jiu-jitsu landscape and get to dominant positions and do what they need to know because they understand what's important here. Hey, clear these legs layer by layer, or on the opposite side, keep the distance, build good connections, and off balance people. Like those are the fundamental, like the ideas are important. It's not how you create that effect. It's understanding what are the things we're trying to create that are like the actual fundamentals. But too often people think it's like, okay, you need to know scissor sweep, cross choke, and armbar from guard if you're going to have a guard, bro. But it's like, not really. You know, you need to understand posture control, creating distance, being able to off balance people. That's what makes the guard the guard. You understand how a strangle works. You close both sides of their neck. Like those things are the actual fundamentals. And I think like we tend to default to like these moves is like, oh, but that shows you how that works. But it's like I could just sort of like help you understand how a choke works. And now you see that everywhere. Because I had guys hit like chokes that I've never taught them at this tournament. One dude hit a standing loop choke on someone just because he found it. Oh, this wedge is in, and he just threw his hips in and finished it. I was like, that was amazing. If I had like shown you, 80 different chokes, you would never have got to loop choke, and you would never have tried that. But you knew, boom, I feel like I have closure on both sides. Let me now, reinforce these wedges and get my finish. And then he did, like that's the thing. And I think sometimes you can prevent people from just actually playing the game when you say like there's only all these little boxes or little like building blocks that make up the fundamentals, right? I'd much rather show you those fundamental mechanics that happen to create effects in your partner.
Yes, and just to round out the teaching versus learning, I often hear people say, oh, someone taught such and such a day, that was awesome, or I learned this and that today. I don't think we can, I think that's a little presumptuous to say you can take away from a session that something was learned. I think that's to be on a longer time scale. So to be quite honest, I just have to trust that putting my people in these positions, it's going to appear later down the line, but I can never truly go away from a session really knowing that these people have learned something. Again, we're the framework that we're putting in and putting them in these situations. I'm assuming there's learning going on, but I think that's very, very difficult to judge. And I don't know. Do you understand what I'm saying there?
Oh yeah. So there's a term in mathematics called revision to the means, and in our field, it's just kind of simple way you can say it is if there's a peak, there's going to be a valley. And over time, we have a bunch of peaks and valleys. And what we'll see increase is neither the peak nor valley, but the means in between. So again, every time someone does something well, they're going to do something bad. And this is kind of that, peak valley fluctuation that happens as the learning process occurs. And so when we're looking at somebody, we're watching them, like you said, over time, and we're looking for this means of behavior, this general level of consistency that will start to emerge over time based on your student's ability to do something. And it's critical that that something is defined, because if we don't know what they're trying to do, we can't see these peaks and valleys, and then damn sure we can't see the means. So we can't ultimately say that learning has occurred. So we say that learning has occurred when a skill is developed. Well, then skill is defined by something that can be done consistently at a low energy cost in a timely manner. And so again, the means at which this appears determines whether someone's learning or not. So a coach can see learning, but again, it's not in the traditional sense like I have a loop choke now, right? Mm-hmm. And another thing we have to consider too is learning is sensitive to loss. If you stop practicing, it'll go away like everything else. So really, in any given game, in any given behavior, we have a means of something that will stick around as what we would call something that's learned. And it's usually much more foundational and simple than we give it credit for.
Yeah, I think, and you made an interesting point there. I think when I looked through the more traditional lens before, it was very, very binary, very, very, the binary metric, did it work or did it not work? Now I'm seeing through a different lens. It's more of these, are these relationships starting to appear? Are they just having these tendencies to couple their movements to what's going on? And especially, we're sticking with the grappling here, but with the striking here, if someone's throwing a kick, are they just starting to build that relationship and move appropriately over time? And so that's how I try to evaluate learning between and within sessions.
Oh, for sure. I definitely think it takes a coach a while to see it. You know what I mean? And every coach, of course, is different. So some coaches think learning may be occurring, other coaches may not think so. So like, this argument I give with people all the time, people get mad at me because I say that people aren't good at jiu-jitsu. They think they are, but they're not. And when people come in and I see as somebody's trained for 15 years get their ass beat by Noah, it's like, yeah, you never learned anything. You just thought you did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, learning. So the APA has a sort of catch-all definition for learning. You're going to have to modify a little bit, I think, for motor learning. But the catch-all is a relatively permanent change in behavior as a result of experience, practice, or training. Now, the word relatively in there is an important word. It's not just a word that's sprinkled in for no reason, because it captures the fact that, first of all, it's not entirely permanent. If you wait too long without practicing that skill again or using that skill again, I mean, you could go 20, 30, 40 years without it, then it just might not be there anymore for you. But it also encapsulates the fact that it diminishes over time. So if you're at a high level of performance, that level is going to diminish if you don't practice the same, or if you just stop practicing, it's going to diminish a lot. I don't know. I would go to the point of saying that that you haven't learned it if that the learning goes away if on a shorter time scale. But if it's not stable, then it's not learning. And if it doesn't transfer, then it's certainly not learning. Because if you're good at your, the flavor of the last week has been uchikomi and judo, because I released that episode with Cal Jones and it blew up on the judo subreddit, and people throw around the word learning. And I've seen this used as a way to really berate students and like imply that they are not trying hard enough. And this idea of, okay, throw the kick in the air, do the bridge. Okay, you've learned it now because I saw you do it.
Your mic went out, man.
I've lost you, Josh. Oh.
Oh, look, he's got a little symbol.
While he's
I need a symbol, guys.
While he's reconnecting, Kabir, anything to add to that?
I mean, yeah, it's really interesting. I think oftentimes people think of learning as really much like, oh, I've seen that technique, I know it. Whereas really like the actual learning, I always think of it as like my goal is just to increase your exposure to situations so you can continue to build awareness in that situation. Because that's really the difference between very elite competitors and like novices, is they've been in situations enough so they can actually have the ability to like know what to do, in the sense that not like what move to do, but they're perceiving what's happening. They have like the right prioritization. They can sort of feel what's most important, what's least important. Whereas, that's what we're trying to, I think is train is people's ability to understand what's happening, be aware of the situation, because that's the big thing is like, black belts, they just do the right thing. They aren't making those inherent big mistakes of not being in the right place at the right time. Whereas a novice just doesn't understand that situation enough to know what sort of priority is. Like, oh, my priority should have been making connections, not trying to get on top, or what, like those type of things. So I really have a hard time saying somebody like learn to move. Like I have people this week who came to every class this week, but I'm not going to like say that they learned how to finish a triangle strangle. They're just like more aware of what that situation contains now, what sort of little mini fights happen within that. But yeah, I find it hard to really ever say something like learn. They just like know it a little bit more. They're more familiar with a thing, because I don't really think it's going to be like a finite end either.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I would go even further and be a little more harsh about it. And I would say that if you can't effectively do something, you've learned nothing. Like, I don't care what you say can you do the thing? Because we're playing a game of performance. We're playing a game where I have to physically do something to another person. So I can say all I want about what I used to know or thought I knew or did one time. But if I put you with someone you can't do it, you haven't learned it. And so, I mean, again, this is where I guess the knowledge about and knowledge of comes into play, because I could sit here and say my knowledge about jiu-jitsu far exceeds my knowledge of, like, the things that I can talk about intellectually versus the things I can do physically far outweigh each other. So I would, because again, we have to know what field are we talking about? What level of learning are we talking about? Again, are we talking about someone's ability to perform? Or are we talking about someone's ability to regurgitate? Because those are two different things. So I think we got to be clear about what type or, what type of learning we're talking about.
You guys
and
hear me?
I hear you now, Josh. And I don't think you're suggesting that both can't be important.
No,
I think
you need, of course.
Yep.
Because we're cognitive in one side and then let's just split this hair just for the sake of argument. We're behavioral on another. I'm not saying they're different things. All right. I'm just saying that, like, we can talk about something without doing it. We can do something without knowing what the hell we're talking about. So, like, again, I think they ultimately reinforce each other because they're a constraint in and of itself. So if there's something in your mind and you're thinking about it and it's going through this cognitive process and you're playing with it in your head, that can affect the emergent quality of your behavior in some sense. We can't say at what level because, again, it's nonlinear. We don't know. But we do know that people who tend to think a lot about the things they do and to talk a lot about what they do tend to be a little better at performing it because it's kind of they're involved completely at all levels, whether it be just those at the level of thought and those at the level of performance.
Yeah, and you mentioned the non-linearity there. Kabir and I spoke about this the other day. We used the analogy of when someone tells you, gives you advice how to be a parent. If you do this, your child will turn out like this. And if someone tells you that, they're fucking lying. And I have two kids. I got like a 3-step kid. I know. So I think it's important to stress that as we come across with this approach that we are not saying, because we can't say it. We're honest enough to say we can't say if we suggest input A, then or if we do X, Y will happen. What we're bringing is a set of, again, principles that are informed by the data and the research, and we're saying if we kind of tick these boxes, what should emerge at the end of it is more robust skill set and learning. So this goes back to when people maybe reach out to me. I'm happy to share them. What games do you play? What is the game for this? And I say, well, for me, it's missing the point. That's just moving the problem from what technique will I show? What is the detail to this technique to what game? And I of course, because that's the games I play, I think they're probably effective, but I don't quite know that yet. And just copying games, I think, isn't really moving the ball up the field that much.
Well, so back to nonlinearity, like, again, it's just input-output ratio. Input is thing we do, output is thing we get. And we're talking about the effect on learning. So we don't know exactly, like, per unit, what we do has what effect. So, like, this is, again, why drilling is bad. What is a rep? If rep is supposed to create a change in us as it relates to what we're trying to ultimately achieve, then how much of it? Again, we have no access to that knowledge, but we do know if we engage in this situation and we focus on doing these things, something is more likely to emerge. So, and again, that's the game problem, right? So people want an input. That's the game. And well, how do we play the game? How much time do we play the game for? What are the rules of the game? I don't know. I don't know. We try to inform ourselves as best we can at what actions might be beneficial to the student, but it constantly has to be changed because, like I said, we don't know input-output ratio, so we have to constantly change the inputs until we get something that looks like the output that we're seeking. And your example with 2 children is apparently obvious. You could have one child who you say one thing to, and you get this wonderful series of behaviors out of, and the other one didn't even hear you. So, again, we're in the same field as coaches, right?
Well, in my case, none of my kids hear me. Kabir, have you anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think with that, so just talking about this idea where people want the game that'll create this effect. One, of course, we can't guarantee it'll be any effect, but a good crafted game, our hope is that it increases the opportunity for you to understand what's important, what's happening, things like that. But another thing is, like, your games have to be sort of dynamic, and I might run a game and I'll see the way it's being received or the way it was understood in the room. I have to be able to make a pivot, whether that's in maybe how I try and cue or pre-frame the game the next time, whether, just like you have to react, like, we're all about like reacting to the environment as like a big approach, but then coaches want to be super cut and dry. Like, I plugged in this game and it should work, but no, there's perception action all the time, right? So as a coach, we have to be doing that too. And I think that can be a thing is where we just assume, but you have to be able to read the room. I have to see, no one is actually thinking about this at all in this situation, right? And that's why I can't give you a one-size-fit-all game, but we can sort of, like, you just have to be training your eyes. It sounds silly because it's literally what we're talking about trying to get the athletes to do, but the coaches need to be doing it in order to actually implement effectively and be able to give their students the opportunity to, train their attention and intention. Is you have to be watching them because they're reacting on the fly too. And you have to be able to, like, monitor and adjust and actually adapt and read what's really happening. Whereas I think so many people just want to turn their brain off and like, okay, so here's the game, get past the line of the feet, go. But that maybe is not enough, and you have to be willing to look at it for real.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's a great way to say it. And I think Rob Gray is starting to try to help people understand that now too, with his new like coaching coaches how to coach ecologically, because again, we're doing it too. Like we're seeing the affordances in the environment, and we're using what we think we see to inform ourselves as to what to do about it. So just like the guys practicing on the mat are, it's just our game is how to use information to affect student behavior, and their job is how to use information to hold that person down. So again, we're all messing with information and trying to pick up affordances and trying to decide what's the best way to go about getting the result that we want.
I think, Josh, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, he's here. Okay. So I think that might round off this episode nicely here. If maybe we finish with what the anatomy of what we think is good game design is. But you both mentioned something there. So, and I'd like to finish off with the one of the other pushbacks is and something Josh just released an article about that is scaling the games. So I'll let Josh finish off with that. But you mentioned perception action coupling. There will be a lot of buzzwords getting thrown around here, and you mentioned information, which is kind of a bedfellow of that, Greg. So do you want to maybe talk quickly a bit about perception action coupling, Kabir, and how that's so crucial to what we're actually advocating for and what we're trying?
Yeah, if you think at the core of what we're trying to help our students do is be able to read and react, right? It's like playing any sport. Hey, I see a defense is moving this way. That might mean this, that, or that, right? You have to learn what is happening and what that might mean. And what I was saying on the coach side is we have to be able to do that too, right? We can't just say it's a linear thing. And that's why lots of times I think of the training is it's exposure to increase awareness, right? It's like we're trying to boost their awareness points in this context so that they're better at interpreting that information and converting it into some meaningful action that, leads to a net positive performance for them, right? And that has to be the main thing, because that's the big argument for me against just drilling. Drilling sucks because you aren't learning to read anything. You're just learning to you might as well have a dummy in your home and just watch YouTube videos. Like there's no benefit. If we have a tool that can give us reactions, movement, that kinesthetic, like feeling, we have to learn what does that feel like when they're about to bridge, right? I can't describe what it feels like when they're about to bridge. I can only put you in that situation enough so that you can start to feel it and build that sense, right? And we're trying to help them. Like perception is not just eyes. In many other sports, when they talk about perception action, they're talking about reading the environment. But in jiu-jitsu, there's such like a kinesthetic element to it that we have to put them in positions to where they can learn that tactile sensation of, oh, this is about to happen. Or, that's why the drilling is, I think, makes it so hard for people to build real jiu-jitsu skills, is because we're taking away the feel, right? We're removing that one live element that'll actually help them. That's why, I think you have to focus on that perception action and just understand that in jiu-jitsu is more about touch than sight. Although both are still 100% there, reading and recognizing. But that's just sort of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I'll act as a little bridge in between there, because I don't ever think perception action is ever decoupled or switched off. What I think is we're just perceiving and acting with either the wrong information or impoverished information. So Greg, maybe you want to take the other side of that bridge and explain a little bit about what information is. And before you do, just exactly what you said about sight there. I had my second congenitally blind student come in this week to start with us.
Oh, dang.
And he's been rolling for a couple of years. It's quite remarkable. Like congenitally blind and able to get a decent roll. So that kind of kicks the old needing to be able to see things in the arse kind of thing, So go ahead, Greg. Kabir talked about perception action. I mentioned, are we perceiving and acting with the relevant information? You want to just give a little bit of talk about what information is in the context of what we're speaking about.
So all the actions we take are relative to what we're trying to do. So for example, if we are playing a game of pinning, then we're trying to pin someone who's always resisting. So that's information. So it's their resistance to what we're trying to do that tell us what to do next, or what we're currently doing is either effective or not. So again, we're only doing things to resisting bodies because we only play a game where there are only resisting bodies. So if we do anything outside of resistance, we're no longer playing the game. And so so the reason people tend to shy away from this is because of something I've been calling the scalability problem. They don't know how to scale efforts, right? They don't know what's too much, what's too little, what's too chaotic. And I found some solutions to this. But either way, again, the only information that we can use really is what we gain from playing the game in a real way. I can't even say that anymore. Like, I'm so far into it that the game doesn't exist without resistance. I can't even think of it like that. So anyway, yeah, the only information that we use is what happens when we're playing.
And I think that ties in beautifully to Josh to maybe finish this out. You just wrote an article recently because one of again, the pushback you get, oh, well, it's too chaotic for new students. And that then brings in the concept of scalability. You want to talk a bit about that to round things off?
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing I want to say about information before I talk about the scalability of what we're doing and why it's different from something like positional sparring. Information in the ecological approach is the idea that what we perceive in the environment is already structured in a way that it is comprehensible to us. The information processing is called information processing because perceptual data that is largely unstructured is processed through something in our head that makes it information, that makes it comprehensible. And so it has to go through a schema or a mental model to become less impoverished or to become enhanced. And then through that processing, it then becomes usable to us. Whereas in the ecological approach, obviously there's a little bit of gray area because we have to have experience sometimes with unfamiliar surfaces in order to understand how we can interact with them. But that's more behavioral, it's more learning. It doesn't need to be sort of abstractly processed. The world around us is structured in a way that's already comprehensible to us as soon as we come into contact with it, as soon as we recognize the surface. So that's the difference between information as information processing people use the term and the way that we use the term. We're assuming that the information is already comprehensible in some way. As far as scalability goes, it's not, what we do is not just more positional sparring. It can be scaled, it can be enhanced, it can be scaled up, it can become more complex for some reason, like a differential learning effect, or greater degrees of psychological pressure, affective design, or it can be scaled down. So if the task is too complex for somebody who's brand new, and part of this is individual, because I think some people can handle greater degrees of complexity when they first start than other people can. So the thing that I've been saying is that the constraints-led approach, scalable live training, can be less or more than positional sparring. Positional sparring is kind of a fixed slice of the game. It's like a middle slice. It's a position. Whereas scalable live training can go down, and it can be concerned with maybe one goal instead of two, like a goal and an embedded goal or something like that. Which isn't to say that you should stay there. I don't think if you're gonna do something that is very scaled down, then it really should only be a few times. It shouldn't be, we're going to do this for 3 months and then we're going to move on to the next step. So scalability is really, we want to make the task simpler, but we do not want to impoverish the information. So it needs to be, the rules need to be constrictive enough that you can focus within a skill range, a single skill. But not so restrictive that the behavior becomes too unrealistic to the actual performance context. And I guess that's kind of a broad way of saying it, but that's where I'm at right now.
That's great. And I'm sure we can all agree, that with scalability, we can have someone brand new who's never done a minute of jiu-jitsu in their life walk into each of our gyms or environments, and we will be putting them in some live situation immediately.
Yeah. So, and maybe next episode, we can talk about that.
We can talk about that. I think maybe to round it off and maybe anyone could take away from them. I have my ideas. I'd like to pass it around the table just as an outro here. You have a thought process, or what is the anatomy of a game? We spoke about this before, Greg. I've got my own kind of 4-step process that I share with my coaches, that if they're ticking these boxes, generally I think we're on the right page. You want to start with that?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I always start with definitions and objectives. So remember, we're playing a game that's constructed. So there is an aspect of, I guess, indirect information there. So if we're talking about the guard, if I say that word to some random person, they have no idea what that means. So we show them what the guard is. We define it for them based on its function. Okay, so we say that, all guards serve the same function. Their job is to make and maintain connection for the purpose of controlling distance. Start off that simple definition, and then you give them an objective. Okay, the objective of this situation is to do X. If we're working from the bottom player's perspective, it would be to make and maintain these connections while the other player tries to do X. In this case, it could be remove the connections. So now we have defined terms, we have objective, and then now we can create a game around how we want to manipulate those two things. What do we want the students to understand? And really what we always want them to understand is the functionality of the engagement, because nothing beyond function really matters, right? We need to first be effective and then everything else comes after. So if we want to create a good game, we need to define the terms, we need to create an objective, and then we need to give our students some focus of intention and tell them where to focus their attention to engage within the game. And then we have something that we can consider usable for the process of learning.
Excellent, Josh. Anatomy of a game for you, of an effective
So
game.
there are objective. Each player in the game has a clear objective. Sometimes they both have the same objective. If you're doing maybe a scaled down game, they have different objectives, like you have a single goal for each. But there's an objective for the game. There are clear winning conditions, and the behavior is self-determined and competitive, or I would call that uncooperative.
Greg, you're shaking your head there. We're having our first intergroup disagreement.
No, I'm just picky when I hear things. I just kind of shake my head only because sometimes things I don't know. No,
go ahead, speak freely, boy.
No,
let's go.
I think he's calling you an asshole, Josh.
No, not at all. So you can't have the same objective within a game because it's a zero-sum game. So the only time that we can have similar objective is when there's true neutrality. And the only position in Jiu-Jitsu has true neutrality is the standing position. So in essence, we're in the standing position is the only position where we're fighting for the same thing. But unevenness is actually what causes outcome. So once an unevenness occurs, outcome immediately occurs thereafter. And so again, there is no game where we have the similar objective unless it's true neutral. And I was just being picky in my mind about that. I'm sorry.
So let me explain what I meant by sometimes the objectives are different. This is something I've worked out more in the context of a striking sport. So, and this is this is like a literal introduction level, live sort of exercise. This is not something that you do indefinitely. I call it a single goal exercise or a single goal game. And in the context of something like a kickboxing or sport taekwondo or sport karate, there is an attacker and his or her objective is to score, and there is a defender whose objective is not to be scored upon. And it becomes a multi-goal objective when they are both trying to score and not be scored upon. But there is a different objective between the two. And that's why I said for a scaled down version, it's a very, that's like level 1 scaled down. This is the first day that you've walked on to the mat. But beyond that, you shouldn't be doing that very often, or you shouldn't be doing that for a long time. It should be just a few times. And then everything should be multi-goal beyond that because you have a representative issue. That's what I meant by that. But for most of what you do, you mostly have the same sort of objectives.
Well, when you say same objectives, I'm just trying to understand that because when we say same, I don't see in zero-sum games, I don't really see sameness anywhere in the system unless we haven't engaged yet. So unless the two systems haven't engaged, that's the only time that we can have the same objective. And the other thing, anyway, if you want to answer that.
I agree with you both, unsurprisingly. I think, and I think what Josh was saying, it maybe because the striking, it starts from more of a neutral position. There's generally an asymmetry in jiu-jitsu. There's a top and bottom player and whatnot. But I guess, like you said, Greg, the neutrality comes from the single task goal could be to take your partner down from a neutral position. So in that sense, there's I agree with you both. Kabir, you want to keep? Yeah, no, keep.
Oh, I was going to say I have one more issue, and it's this idea that there doesn't always have to be an end objective because so the way we structure our games are from twofold. We have continuous games and terminal games. So there are continuous skills that underlie terminal skills. So for example, the continuous grip fight in the guard passing situation is something that you need to be able to do. So to consistently clear connections and advance lines is something you might have to do for an extended period of time. So practicing that skill for 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 minutes without having a terminal end is a critical aspect of skill building. Whereas if you want to teach people when transition between one meso situation to another happens, you can do something that's more terminal. But again, we have to define the skill more closely before we can say one game would either A, be continuous, or B, would be have terminal aspects to its conclusion.
Yeah, I think we need to, because when I think of a game, I'm thinking of game as defined. There's some external knowledge about that coming in, like definitions from other disciplines, and not just how we use it for designing exercise. I like to use the word exercise because people kind of understand what it is, but it also doesn't encapsulate the aliveness of what we're doing. But so like a winning condition is usually part of a game, as most people use the word, and it's fine. We can modify and use the word the way we need to for our context. But for me, I mean, even a winning condition could be just maintaining or not being scored upon or something like that. But yeah, it's maybe we need to differentiate between objective and goal.
Okay, or the win condition could be continuous or terminal.
Sure. Yeah, just maintaining could be a winning condition versus, creating a change in state.
Right. No. Yeah.
Yeah.
Kabir, you've got an added constraint. It's mostly kids you work with, but what's your anatomy of a good kids game? Or a good game generally?
So it's always the same thing that sort of like we were talking about here as far as like the base foundation. I'm always going to start with that high level overview. Let's have a clear set start position. Really the same thing. But one thing I do, and I'm not sure if you guys really play with this too much, is I'll play games where one partner really can't win. They just can continually make the other partner have problems and the other partner can win. So for example, like yesterday, we were playing a game, standing versus supine player. The standing player's goal is to play to the outside and try and camp out at the line of the shoulders as long as they can. And they always have to have at least one knee up. So their whole game is just constantly work to be there. The bottom player can reset the game if at any time they can achieve a closed guard. And that is sort of sometimes how I'll blend those elements. And that's another style of game that we use all the time. Like one player is just continuously making your life hard, which is good, and you have one way that the bottom player can actually reset and win that game. That's just like another sort of variant that we do. And we find it's super good, very effective at skills for both because, that's just something I want to mention. We do that often. It looks like Greg might be in agreement to do that too.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been doing it this week. So like, I like to really define those 2 points because I think they highlight different things about the environment. So because at a foundational level, I think a lot of the skills are more continuous than they are terminal. They don't end, right? So your ability to continuously move around the mat and grip fight for a specific end oftentimes is a continuous skill. And I like that because sometimes if you're playing a game where both players have continuous skills, it's exhausting. So if you give one player a condition they have to meet for as long as they can, and the other player a condition that if they meet, it ends the game, it creates a sense of urgency too, and it's good. We did it all this week from the belly up position with our advanced guys.
All right, that's great. I really don't have anything to add. Maybe the way I explain it might come across a little bit different. I go through a four-stage process. First one is, again, what are we trying to achieve here? That needs to be clear and it needs to be conveyed. And then it's identifying key features of that exchange to build your game. And then I think what's really important, and Josh already alluded to it, was meeting the learners where they're at. Is it scaled appropriately? And lastly, just to kind of recheck the whole thing, does it actually look like a fucking part of the game? Are we playing the game? And again, I keep saying we're rounding off. For my foundations, I'm just going to throw in a little game that I found fascinating last week that was a lot of fun in my foundations class. I had them start in side pin, and the whole objective was to get to the other side of the side pin without getting the bottom player was purely trying to get their legs back involved and get into some kind of guard, and there was an extra bonus for getting in the mount. And we played that game for about 5 minutes. And again, some of the behaviors you see, how they start to, pin each other down, control the hips, control the shoulders, keep them pinned to the mat as they're trying to maneuver around. For me, that's a fascinating way to watch novices and beginners problem solve in real time.
Yeah, this is actually one of the first games we play when we teach side control from the top player's perspective, because it teaches the aspect of mobility and pinability at the same time. Because largely they're dichotomous, because when you completely immobilize your opponent, you tend to also be immobile. When you're completely mobile, moving relative to your opponent, you're at the least immobilizing, largely. So teaching them how to fluctuate between these two skills, these two aspects of a singular skill, I think is wholly beneficial at a foundational level.
I think you're right there. One thing you said there was stay mobile, because if you just tell someone to hold a side pin, they're just going to hold on like a fucking limpet, right? And that's not very authentic either. So forcing them to move while trying to maintain control, I think, has been a really, really powerful game for the beginners. Do you have a game? Sorry, go ahead, Greg.
No, I was just going to say.
Describe the game.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think largely when you're having two people engaged, the more each other gets to see and do, the greater effect we have on learning. So again, holding still for 5 minutes hey, it may teach how strong is your pin, but again, remember, it's not just holding people there, it's progression. So I think it builds a culture of progression when you play games like that.
And I said earlier, it's not about just sharing games or saying this is a game that's going to work, but so I'm kind of contradicting myself here. Kabir, you got a game that you might want to just throw out for someone to take away there that you feel like you get running with straight off the bat, maybe even for kids? It's a game that they all love and you find super engaging and super potent.
Yeah, so here's one thing with games, and sometimes people think what's a game that's fun for a kid, just in that context, is literally any game that they can experience success in. That's all that's fun, is if you set it up clear enough so that they can actually understand how they might win that game. It can be as simple, I always talk about this turtle versus turtle rear body lock situation. Top players just trying to stand up or get chest to chest, bottom players trying to get back up or get chest to chest with the legs in between, get a guard. Bottom players just trying to constantly break them down and achieve a chest to chest pin past the legs or get a hook in. It just has to be clear for the kids. It's not, honestly, we're dealing with the same thing. We just have to be more mindful of language. That's truly the biggest difference between when it comes to coaching a youth athlete versus an adult athlete. And a lot of times people struggle coaching youth because they try and communicate too much information, which is why, in my experience talking with other coaches, when they start trying to just play games with the kids, it forces them to say less and set up smaller slices, which is why it can become so much easier for them to coach and actually see their kids doing jiu-jitsu. Because now it's just simple, or a continuous game we'll play for turtle. Top player, your goal is to constantly keep the partner on their hip or on their shoulder as much as you can when they're the turtle player. Bottom player, your goal is, and this is when they can terminate the game. If you can get back up, the game is over. But you can play those same games, and kids love that because I'm just ragdolling my friend, trying to keep him on the hip, trying to keep him on his shoulder. It's natural. They enjoy that play, but you just have to be able to communicate it in the right language so they know, how do I win? Because that's all kids want to do. If you see a child frustrated, it's because they don't know how they could win or they don't know why they're losing, right? But if you can just be clear in that, any game is a banger as long as you can make sure that you set it up the right way.
Yeah, no, that's great. Those are great.
Josh, you want to finish up there? You got a little game that you like to play, or I know you're not coaching at the moment, but anything that someone could take away after me saying we're not here just to give games and share games?
Yeah, so going back to the single game concept for striking sports, I think you can do this for grappling too, but I don't have as much experience trying those out. My friends have tried the single goal concept out, so I know that they can be helpful for beginners. Basically, just have a defined attacker that's trying to score and have a defined person that's trying to defend. And the reason why I think that's effective and useful for beginners is because if you have a disparity in aggression between two partners, you have a new person that just wants to go all out, and you have a new person that's just not used to being struck at all. They're not going to get experience perceiving for affordances to score. They're just going to be trying to defend, and so you give them a chance to start perceiving those affordances and feeling what it feels like to score and attempt to score and look for openings to score without them worrying about being struck in the face or scored upon. So you can't stay there. You have to move quickly beyond that because there's an obvious trade-off in representativeness with that. But it can be helpful for new beginners and a great way to keep things alive, but scaled down appropriately to a new beginner. And as far as winning conditions go, it's something that it can be a low score, high score thing where you just see how high you can each trial, or see how low you can keep it in terms of not being scored on each trial. Or you can add a winning condition to it. The attacker has to score at least 6 points or at least 5 points, and so the defender knows, how many points he or she has left before he potentially, loses the game, and the attacker also the same. So.
Can I just say something? So I love that idea of structuring games so that one person can experience more success and sort of accounting for like partners. But I much prefer just to make the game where everyone is trying to work in opposition, but then just focus on partnering people appropriately. Because I don't want to like take the fangs out of this guy and have them just game the game. And my goal is I just shell up and keep distance in that saying. I'd rather put the two timid guys with each other so that they can grow in scale, as opposed to trying to restrict the game to account for humans. Just put the right humans together and you can do whatever. That's why like a lot of my classes, both youth and adult, I don't split by age or skill level or whatever. It's just like, I'm going to put the rough and tumble with the rough and tumble, the meek and meager with the meek and meager, and they will both climb appropriately within that. Because I still want it to be the game. Like, I want them to be doing jiu-jitsu full scope, as full of a scope within that narrow slice that we're choosing to focus on. But I love your idea. I just wanted to mention that I think that partnering is so important, and people will shy away from some things that are really good practice activities because they aren't considering partner implications, and they're trying to make it one size fit all, which you can do. You just got to, meddle with the group a little bit.
I think that's a great point, Kabir. Sorry, Greg. And I think being underwhelmed is just as big a problem as being overwhelmed. So, and that's a constant endeavor for the coach, right? Getting the right matchups. And in the big groups, they tend to self-organize and go with people that they're getting the best bang for the buck. Greg, you had something to finish off with there?
No, man, I just completely agree. I do the exact same thing. I'm very particular on partner matchup because of that same reason. I like to put psychologies and physiologies with each other, because you get, rather than trying to control some other aspect of the game that might be more cognitively demanding to control, you let the environment do it itself. It works extremely well. I think Kabir is an undercover thug, and he doesn't realize it. He just likes the roughness. I know.
Well, guys, I think we can round that up today. If you've made it this far, like and subscribe. We're going to be dropping more episodes soon. As all things we advocate for, this conversation will evolve and emerge over time, and we'll get into more specifics. Certainly, if there's any specific questions you'd like to ask any of the group members here, any of the panel, pop it in the comments below, and if we get any good feedback or good questions, we'll address them next time. Let's just go for a quick outro. Greg, anything to finish up with?
No, man. Love talking to you guys. It was fun. I appreciate you having me on.
Josh Peacock.
No, good back and forth, clarifying things internally, in-house, being sharper, being more intentional communicators.
Yeah, I just want to say, if you heard something good, try that shit until you're actually good at it, implementing it. Too often we're like waiting. You just got to like suck a little bit, suck a little less, just try it. Don't just listen and passively absorb. But awesome. I'm happy to be here chatting.
All right. Well, until next time, ladies and gentlemen, adios. All right.